In previous lectures, we encountered the idea that history, at least the kind of history that a historian is interested in, is not just a bunch of facts. Even if the facts were somehow clear to him, the historian still needs to add something, a structure that will make the facts intelligible, that will give us understanding of the facts rather than bare knowledge. If we actually look at texts written by historians, we will see that this structure is often a narrative structure. The historian tells us a story about the past. It is from this observation that Whyte develops his theory of history, which puts narrative, and especially the narrative choices that a historian can make, center stage. Let us start by thinking about the idea of narrative structure. What sorts of structure can we detect in a historical narrative? Well, certainly, the historian needs to have selected facts and ordered them. If you want to write the history of medieval England, you cannot include every fact that you might know or find out about medieval England. There are just too many of them. And since you don't just want to write things down at random, you will have to find a systematic way of ordering those facts that you do choose. Thus, the medieval writers of chronicles might have chosen to include only major facts about kings and battles, and might have chosen to order those facts chronologically. We could then have a text that tells us about the battles and the royal births and deaths in the year 942, and then in the year 943, and so on. But a chronicle like that is not yet a narrative. It starts at a random point, it ends at a random point, and it just gives a list of events in between without any clear connections. A narrative needs more. And among the things it needs are a clear beginning, middle, and end. The role that any fact will play in a historical narrative can change a lot based on where in the narrative it is placed. Take for instance the assassination of Franz Ferdinand of Austria. If I write a historical biography about Franz Ferdinand, this assassination will appear as the sudden and unexpected end of the story. If I write a biography about his assassin, Gavrilo Princip, it will appear in the middle, as an event which has been fully explained by Princip's earlier life and which has a major impact on the rest of his life, which he spent in prison. If I write a history of World War I, then the assassination will appear at the beginning, as a more or less random event which set into motion the political and military machinery that would lead to the war. As we can see, the role of the event will differ very much based on where it is placed in the story. From this example, we can already see that there is, in fact, more narrative structure than just choosing a beginning, a middle, and an end. Take the biography of Franz Ferdinand. It is the story of a life which suddenly ends, quite senselessly, through no real fault of Franz Ferdinand himself. The lesson of this story seems to be clear. History is not a meaningful process. It does not logically work to a certain end. Things just happen to people. It is, in other words, what Whyte would call a satire. Satire is, of course, a literary genre. And for Whyte it is one among 4 literary genres that the historian can choose to deploy when writing history. There is the romantic plot, in which good triumphs over evil. You can easily imagine a history of World War II written as a romantic plot, in which fascism is destroyed by the efforts of decent people. Then there is the comic plot, in which opposing forces in society are, after initial troubles, reconciliated. One could perhaps write a comic history of European politics, in which capitalism and socialism are reconciled by the advent of the democratic welfare state. Then there is the tragic plot, in which high ideals are destroyed, but we learn to live with the limitations of the world. One could maybe write a tragic history of the 60s, in which the ideals of love and peace and happiness fail to work out, and everyone emerges with more wisdom, but less happiness. And finally, there is the satirical plot, which suggests that nothing has a deeper meaning, and that romance, tragedy and comedy are all mistaken, maybe even all forms of wishful thinking. Whyte recognizes other kinds of structure as well, including 4 forms of argumentation, 4 types of political ideology, and 4 types of rhetorical figures that play a role in historical narratives. We can't go into the details of all of those, so I want to just focus on the 4 genres that we have noticed. And before we go and look at the bigger philosophical claims that Whyte draws from his analysis, I want to take a look at how Whyte might classify some of the thinkers that we have already seen. For instance, what about Hegel? When Hegel writes history, is it going to be romantic, with good defeating evil, comic, with opposing forces being brought together and reconciled, tragic, with men learning about the inescapable limitations of reality, or satirical, with the denying of any real meaning? Well, remember Hegel's scheme of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. A synthesis takes the best of the thesis and the antithesis and combines them into something better. This is exactly a comic plot of reconciliation. If Hegel had lived today, he would surely have written the history I suggested a moment ago, in which the historian first explains the problems of capitalism, then the problems of socialism, and then describes how the democratic welfare state combines the best of both, and thus reconciles them. Hegel is evidently a comic historian, which, by the way, doesn't mean that we will laugh a lot when we read Hegel, because, believe me, we don't. What about that very different thinker, Hempel? Well, Hempel believes that all of history is determined by causal laws. This means that he has to deny any real sense of human freedom. If we have discovered that situation A is always followed by situation B, then if we now find ourselves in situation A, there's nothing we can do about it. Situation B is bound to follow. By studying history, we can learn to recognize these laws so that we know the limitations of our world. But they are bound to remain limitations, no matter what lofty ideals we might have. So Hempel's view of history would lead probably to tragic narratives. Narratives where we learn to accept the laws that determine our lives because we see that fighting against them doesn't work. Or maybe it could lead to satirical narratives, in which we no longer believe that studying history really teaches us anything useful for our lives. Now, we move on to the philosophical consequences that Whyte wants to draw from his analysis of historical narrative. Those consequences mostly have to do with the question of realism. Historians want to write about reality. They want to tell us what really happened. So any historian is going to claim that his way of writing history is the most realistic. But what is the most realistic way of writing history? Romantic? Comic? Tragic? Satirical? That, Whyte tells us, is not something that you can find out objectively. If you look at history expecting to see good triumph over evil, then that is what you will find. If you look at history expecting to see just meaningless stuff going on, with every attempt at establishing a lasting good failing, well, then that is what you will see. Genres work a bit like Kuhn's paradigms or Foucault's epistemes. They determine how you look at the world, and there is no neutral way of proving that one is more truthful, more realistic than any of the others. So that is the first big claim that Whyte makes. No way of writing history is more realistic than any other. Of course, that doesn't mean that every historical work is as good as every other. If I write a history of World War II in which Hitler conquers America, as in the Philip K. Dick novel The Man in the High Castle, then I've written something that is completely false. Anyone who reads it, no matter what his or her own preferred genre is, will dismiss it as fiction. In the same way, any physicist in any paradigm will reject a theory which claims that apples fall up instead of down. But what Whyte's theory does mean is that the general views of history as comic, tragic and so on, those general views are all equally realistic. The second big claim that Whyte makes is that professional history, as it is done in the universities, doesn't recognize this. Instead, it believes that you can only write realistic history by avoiding all kinds of moral judgment or judgments about the meaning of events, by avoiding any talk about the triumph of good or the reconciliation of opposites or tragic wisdom. There are just the cold, hard facts of history, many professional historians believe, and you should add nothing to them. But, Whyte points out, this is just as much a choice for one genre, namely for satire. If you make a sharp distinction between historical reality and any meaning that that reality could have for us, then you are effectively saying that there is no real meaning in history. That history is irrelevant for us because we can't learn anything from it. And that just means that you have chosen to write satire, a genre that is neither more nor less objective or realistic or scientific than any of the others. We cannot objectively prove that history has no moral meaning. So a historian who makes that assumption is not more scientific than a historian like Hegel, who believes that history shows us a clear story of reconciliation and progress. In sum, Whyte's philosophy of history shows us a historian who has a choice, a free choice, between several kinds of narrative, none of which is more or less scientific than the other. According to Whyte, the choice for one or another kind is in the end a moral choice that everyone has to make individually. But most of all, he is concerned to teach us that this choice exists and that everyone must make it. There is no neutral way to write history.